My name is Amber Mitchell, and I'm 28 years old. Just a few weeks ago, I faced something that no daughter should ever have to endure. I was barred from attending my own father's funeral. The person responsible for this cruel exclusion was none other than my stepmother, Patricia. That moment is forever seared into my memory, not only for its heartbreak but for the sheer injustice of it. My father wasn't just a parent, he was my closest confidant, my guiding star after my mother's untimely death. We'd formed a bond that was unbreakable, or so I thought. When Mom passed away from breast cancer when I was just 15, it became Dad and me against the world. We clung to each other through the grief, built routines, created memories. He was a rock for me during the darkest time of my life, so to be denied the chance to say my final goodbye to him was a betrayal that Patricia made sure I was kept at arm's length, not only from the funeral, but also from the reading of Dad's will. I arrived at the law office that day, hoping at the very least to honor Dad's wishes, but Patricia stood at the door like a gatekeeper with a smug grin plastered across her face. "This meeting is strictly for heirs named in the will," she sneered. Her voice was syrupy sweet but laced with venom. She truly believed she had won. What she didn't know was that I had come prepared. Tucked securely in my bag was a file, one that would shift the ground beneath her feet. As the attorney unsealed my documents and began to speak, I watched Patricia's face morph from triumphant arrogance to a chalky shade of panic. She hadn't anticipated that my father might have had secrets of his own. If you've ever found yourself on the receiving end of betrayal by family, especially when it comes to rightful inheritances, then you'll understand the storm I was facing. This is the story of how I fought to ensure my father's true intentions were honored. My father, Robert Mitchell, was the kind of man whose presence could fill any room. He built his real estate empire from the ground up after graduating college, pouring blood, sweat, and countless late nights into what would become one of Boston's most respected firms. But despite his ambition, he never let his work take him away from me. He made time for real, meaningful time. Every Sunday, weather permitting, we'd head out to the Boston harbor on his modest sailboat. We'd glide over the water with the sea breeze in our hair, just the two of us and the soft lapping of waves. After our mini voyage, we'd head to the Harborview Cafe for brunch. It became our sacred routine. Over eggs Benedict and coffee, we'd talk for hours. No topic was off limits. He'd listen patiently to my adolescent drama, offering insights that often made more sense years later. "Amber," he'd tell me, "always trust your instincts. Your mother had the sharpest intuition I ever knew, and you've inherited that same gift." When I was 19 and a sophomore at university, Dad met Patricia Winters at a charity gala. She was polished, poised, and seemed genuinely smitten with him. After 4 long years of mourning Mom, I wanted to see Dad happy again, and Patricia appeared to be the answer to his loneliness. She brought along 2 children, Mason, who was 17, and Lindsay, 15. From the very beginning, something about them didn't sit right with me. They were all smiles and flattery, their laughter too loud, their admiration of Dad's lifestyle too obvious. But I gave it my best. I took Lindsay out for coffee in hopes of building a sisterly bond. I talked to Mason about his college applications, trying to find common ground. My dad was clearly falling for Patricia, and I didn't want to stand in the way of his happiness. When I voiced my concerns, he gently reminded me that her kids had experienced loss too. Their father didn't pass, he clarified. He left. Maybe that's even harder to process. The wedding came fast, just 6 months after they met. I stood by Dad's side as his best woman, doing my best to smile as Patricia vowed eternal honesty and love. Something about her tone felt rehearsed, hollow, but I stayed silent for his sake. Then came the changes, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Photos of my mother, once prominently displayed, slowly vanished from shelves and walls, replaced by curated portraits of Patricia and her kids. Precious heirlooms were boxed up and tucked away to make room for her minimalist aesthetic. Our cherished Sunday outings were sabotaged by sudden social obligations. "Robert, don't you remember the Hendersons are coming over today?" Or, "Mason's got a game, we should all be there as a family." When we did get our time together, Patricia found excuses to interrupt. Once calling 8 times in a row over a lost key that turned out to be exactly where it always was. Mason and Lindsay grew increasingly entitled. Mason crashed 2 brand new cars in his first year of driving. Dad replaced them both without hesitation. Lindsay burned through credit cards on designer shopping sprees, and Dad quietly paid the balances. Meanwhile, I chose a different path. Dad had offered to cover my college expenses, but I insisted on working part-time and taking out modest student loans. Not because I didn't appreciate his help, but because I valued standing on my own feet. "You're just as headstrong as your mother," he'd say with a proud smile. "She never took handouts either." I moved to Seattle after college for a marketing job in a growing tech firm. It was hard being away from him, but we kept our bonds strong with daily calls and monthly visits. Over time, though, I noticed he looked more worn out. His spark dimmed. Whenever I brought up my concerns, Patricia would swoop in with her trademark dismissiveness. "Amber, stop being dramatic. He's just getting older." But I knew something was wrong. His heart was failing, and he was losing weight. His medications seemed to change constantly, and he was often confused. During one of my last visits, 3 months before his passing, he asked Patricia to leave us alone. She did, reluctantly. Once we were alone, he grasped my hand tightly. "Amber," he whispered, "I've been making things right. If anything happens to me, talk to Eleanor at the office. She has something for you." Before he could say more, Patricia returned, smiling coldly as she handed him a glass of water and his pills. "Time for your medicine, Robert," she cooed, though her eyes narrowed when they met mine. That was the last meaningful exchange I had with him. I kept calling every day after that, but increasingly Patricia would answer and claim he was asleep or too tired to talk. I never got the chance to say goodbye. The moment slipped away from me like sand through my fingers. It was a Tuesday night, and I was still at the office, deeply engrossed in finalizing a major marketing campaign. The flickering lights of my computer screen were the only illumination in the room when my phone suddenly lit up. The caller ID read Mason. That alone was enough to make my stomach twist. My stepbrother had never called me directly before, ever. "Your dad's in the hospital," he said bluntly the moment I answered, not even a greeting. "Mom told me to call you." My heart plummeted to the floor. "What happened? Is he okay?" "I don't know the details," Mason replied in a bored tone. "Mom just said to tell you he's at Boston General," and with that he hung up. No warmth, no concern, no chance to ask anything more. I didn't hesitate. I booked the earliest flight I could find, a red-eye, leaving in just under 3 hours. I tossed clothes into a suitcase without thought, barely remembering to grab my phone charger and wallet. My mind spiraled with fear and worst-case scenarios. Each minute of that 5-hour flight dragged like a lifetime, my nerves fraying more with every passing second. When I landed at Logan Airport and arrived at Boston General around 7 a.m., I all but sprinted to the information desk. "Robert Mitchell," I said, breathless. "He was admitted yesterday. I'm his daughter." The receptionist gave me a tight-lipped smile and pointed me toward the cardiac care unit on the 4th floor. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as the elevator climbed. The doors opened, and there they were. Patricia, Lindsay, and Mason, sitting in the waiting area. Patricia looked as poised as ever, flawless makeup, perfectly styled hair, and not even a crease in her designer blouse. It was as if she were attending a brunch, not waiting outside a critical care unit. "Patricia," I called out as I approached. "What's going on? How is he? What happened?" She stood slowly, placing herself between me and the corridor that led to the patient rooms. Her posture was firm, defensive. "Amber, you didn't need to come all the way out here," she said calmly. "Of course I did. He's my father. I need to see him." Her eyes turned steely, her tone sharpening. "The doctors are only allowing immediate family to visit at the moment. Robert needs rest. We can't have any emotional disruptions." Her words hit me like a slap. "I am immediate family," I said firmly. "I'm his daughter." Patricia gave me a pained smile, the kind people wear when they're lying through their teeth. "The doctors were very clear. Family only. We'll call you if anything changes." Behind her, Lindsay gave me a mocking smirk while Mason looked down at his shoes, clearly uncomfortable but saying nothing. Furious and feeling shut out, I walked to the nurse's station and tried again. "My name is Amber Mitchell. Robert Mitchell is my father. I need to see him." The nurse frowned, scanning her notes. "His wife indicated that his only children are already here." "That's not true," I said, voice trembling with frustration. "She's his second wife. I'm his biological daughter. From his first marriage, please. I just want to see my dad." The nurse looked conflicted, caught in a family conflict she clearly didn't want to wade into. "Let me speak with Mrs. Mitchell and the attending physician," she said gently. I waited, and waited. Hours passed. During that time, Patricia and her kids came and went from Dad's room, breezing past me without so much as a glance. I sat there, helpless, tethered to a hope that kept slipping further out of reach. Eventually, a doctor approached. "Miss Mitchell?" he asked, extending a hand. "I understand there's some confusion about visitation. Your father is currently heavily sedated. His condition is serious but stable. We're closely monitoring his cardiac function. I'll allow you a brief visit, but he likely won't be conscious." Relief surged through me. At last, a chance to see him, even if he couldn't speak. As the doctor led me down the hall, I caught sight of Patricia stepping out of the room. She saw us and immediately intercepted. "Doctor, a moment," she said sweetly, pulling him aside. They spoke in hushed tones I couldn't hear. When he returned, his expression had changed, hardened. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Mrs. Mitchell has informed us that your father made it explicitly clear that he didn't want any visitors outside of his household during this hospital stay. As his designated medical proxy, we have to honor her decisions. I stared at him in disbelief. That's not true. He wouldn't say that. He asked for me the last time I saw him. Please, just 5 minutes. I'm sorry, the doctor repeated, truly, but our hands are tied. When I refused to leave the floor, hospital security was called. I was escorted out, humiliated, heartbroken, and desperate. I spent the next 3 days trying everything. I came during shift changes, hoping to find a more sympathetic nurse. I waited in the parking garage to catch doctors on their way out. I called hospital administration, filed complaints, even considered legal action. But Patricia had locked down his access completely. On the 4th day, while I sat alone in the hospital cafeteria, a woman in scrubs approached. She looked around cautiously before sitting down across from me. "You're Robert Mitchell's daughter, right?" she asked in a hushed voice. "Yes," I said, my pulse racing. "Have you been caring for him? How is he?" She glanced around, lowering her voice. "My name's Rachel. I probably shouldn't be talking to you, but something about all this feels off. Your father's been asking for you." My breath caught. "He's awake, but Patricia told everyone he was in a coma." Rachel shook her head. "No, he drifts in and out, but he's been lucid. Yesterday, he specifically asked where you were." Tears blurred my vision. "Can you help me see him?" "I'll try," she whispered. "I'm working the night shift tomorrow. Come at 11 p.m. after visiting hours. I'll see if I can get you in just for a moment." That night, I barely slept. I watched the clock all day, counting down the hours. My hope reignited. But at 6:00 a.m. my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. "Miss Mitchell," the voice on the line said, "this is Dr. Kaplan from Boston General. I'm so sorry to inform you that your father passed away about an hour ago." Everything stopped. "What? No, that can't be. He was stable." "I'm very sorry," the doctor said gently. "He suffered a massive cardiac arrest early this morning. We attempted resuscitation, but we were unsuccessful." I was numb. I never got to say goodbye, never got to hold his hand, or whisper that I loved him one last time, and Patricia had made sure of it. She took full control of the funeral arrangements. Despite knowing Dad always said he wanted to be buried in the same chapel where we held my mother's service, Patricia booked an upscale funeral home instead. It was flashy, cold, completely unlike him. When I arrived, an usher led me to a seat in the back row. Up front, Patricia sat like royalty, flanked by Mason and Lindsay in the family section, as if they were the only ones who had ever mattered to him. From the back row, I watched as wave after wave of mourners stepped forward, offering their condolences to Patricia and her children. They embraced her, whispered kind words, and some even shared tears, many of them people who had known my father for decades. Several glanced back at me, their expressions tinged with confusion and, for a few, guilt. They recognized me, of course. I was Robert Mitchell's daughter, yet here I was, seated far from the family section, left out of the very moment that was supposed to honor him. Some of Dad's oldest friends refused to play along. One by one, they broke ranks, walking over to where I sat. They offered silent handshakes, shoulder squeezes, or brief hugs. Their eyes said more than words ever could. Acknowledgement, sadness, outrage at the treatment I had endured. When Patricia rose to give the eulogy, the atmosphere changed. She took to the podium with rehearsed grace, the very picture of a grieving widow. Her voice trembled just enough to seem genuine. She painted herself as the loving, devoted partner who had selflessly nursed Robert through his final illness. She spoke of our blended family as though we had shared warm holidays and heartfelt moments. Not once did she mention my name. I sat frozen, each word driving the knife in deeper. She was rewriting history right there in front of everyone, and no one was stopping her. When it was time to view the body, I stood, hoping for a final, unhurried moment alone with my father. But as I approached the casket, Patricia's brother stepped directly into my path. "Family first," he barked, blocking me with his bulk. His tone was as cold and unyielding as stone. I stood my ground, but by the time they allowed me to proceed, the funeral staff was already closing the lid. My final look at my father was brief and obscured by their rush, just a flash of his face, peaceful but distant, a moment stolen from me like so many others. The reception that followed was held at a nearby event hall, adorned with white roses and polished wood furniture. It felt more like a gallery opening than a wake. I tried to blend into a quiet corner, wanting to disappear. That's when I overheard Patricia in conversation with a tall man in a tailored suit. I recognized him immediately, Gregory Harrison, her longtime attorney. "We'll proceed with the reading on Tuesday," he told her, flipping through a leather-bound folder. "Everything is in order." "Good," Patricia replied, her voice calm and assured. Robert was very specific about what he wanted. Everything is exactly as it should be. The satisfaction in her tone made my stomach churn. I left soon after, climbing into my rental car with tears blurring my vision. I drove in silence back to my hotel, the city outside passing in streaks of gray and gold. It was all too much. The loss, the exclusion, the injustice. Patricia had won, or so it seemed. She had not only isolated Dad in his final days, but now she controlled the narrative. That night in my hotel room, I cried harder than I had in years. The sobs came in waves, deep and exhausting, until my body ached and my pillow was soaked. It felt like I had lost everything. My father, my history, my sense of justice. What I didn't know was that my father had anticipated all of this, and he had made plans to protect me, plans that were about to be revealed. 3 days after the funeral, I was still staying at a modest Hampton Inn just a short drive from the neighborhood where I had grown up. I couldn't bring myself to fly back to Seattle, not yet. I had taken bereavement leave from work, but beyond that, I had no plans. Grief hollowed me out. I moved through hours in a haze, barely eating, barely sleeping. A knock at the door jolted me from my daze. I wasn't expecting visitors. Everyone on Patricia's side had made it abundantly clear that I was no longer welcome. I opened the door hesitantly, and there, standing in the hallway, was Eleanor Davis. Eleanor had been my father's executive assistant for 15 years. She was in her 60s, dignified, always impeccably organized. I remembered her fondly, always polite but never overly familiar. Today, though, she looked nervous, constantly glancing down the hallway as though being seen here might jeopardize her safety. "Eleanor," I said, stepping back, "what are you doing here?" "May I come in?" she asked quickly. "I shouldn't be seen here, but this is important." I nodded and led her into the room. Once inside, she reached into her oversized purse and withdrew a sealed manila envelope. The wax seal was deep red, imprinted with the symbol from my father's signet ring, the one that had belonged to his grandfather, a family heirloom passed through generations. "Your father gave me this 6 months ago," she said, handing it to me. "He made me swear I would deliver it to you in person, and only if something happened to him. He said it was vital that no one else know about it. Not Patricia, not the firm, no one." My hands trembled as I took it. "Did he say what it was?" "No, only that you would understand what to do," she said, then glanced at her watch. "I have to go. Patricia's been at the office every day since he died, digging through files, firing people. She's trying to erase things." After she left, I sat on the bed, staring at the envelope. I was afraid of what it might say, of what it might mean, but also desperate for a final connection with Dad. Finally, I broke the seal. Inside were 3 items: a handwritten letter on his personal stationery, a sealed legal document bearing the logo of Harrington & Associates, a law firm I didn't recognize, and a small key taped to a card bearing the address of a First National Bank branch with a safe deposit box number. With trembling hands, I opened the letter. "My dearest Amber," it began, "if you are reading this, then my worst fears have come to pass. I am so sorry for the pain you must be feeling, and more sorry still that I am not there to comfort you. I made a mistake, a terrible one, in trusting Patricia. Over the last year, I've seen troubling changes. Items disappearing, important documents moved, medications that made me feel worse instead of better, old friends being turned away at the door. I thought I was imagining things. But then I found proof that Patricia has been in contact with her ex-husband. The same man she told us abandoned her. That was a lie. The truth is far more sinister. I changed my will 6 months ago. The enclosed document is a notarized copy of that will, prepared by a separate firm. Patricia knows nothing of it. The key is for a safety deposit box. Inside, you'll find evidence, photos, statements, a flash drive with recorded conversations. Use it if Patricia contests the will, which I believe she will. Also inside are personal effects I wanted you to have. I had hoped to confront her myself, but my health has declined faster than expected, Amber. Amber, always remember, I love you. You have been the greatest joy of my life. Your mother would be proud beyond words. All my love, Dad." By the end of the letter, I could barely see through the tears. It was everything I had feared and everything I had needed. He had seen the truth. He had taken action. He had not abandoned me. I left the sealed legal envelope untouched, keeping the seal intact. Something told me I would need it exactly as it was. The morning after I read my father's letter, I awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. Grief still clung to me like a second skin, but beneath it stirred something sharper: determination. At 9 a.m., I arrived at First National Bank, gripping the small key and card that had been taped to my father's final message. After presenting my identification and confirming access with the bank manager, I was led through a series of corridors to the vault. There, in the sterile, secure silence, I was left alone with the safety deposit box. Inside, the box contained a collection of items that would change everything. On top was another letter from Dad. His handwriting was instantly familiar, neat and deliberate. In this note, he provided detailed explanations for the evidence I was about to examine. He had laid it all out like a puzzle meant only for me to solve. There were photographs first, grainy, time-stamped, and damning. A private investigator, hired discreetly by my father, had captured Patricia in intimate meetings with a man Dad identified as her supposedly estranged ex-husband. This was the same man she claimed had abandoned her and her children. The photos showed them sharing drinks, embracing, even entering a hotel together. More shockingly, there were images of this same man entering and leaving our family home, always when Dad was away on business trips. In one image, he was even seen handling documents in Dad's study. The implication was clear. Patricia had not just been lying, she was actively conspiring. The next stack of papers included financial records. My father had printed bank statements and highlighted suspicious transactions, large wire transfers from his personal accounts to a series of offshore accounts. These accounts were traced, according to annotations in Dad's handwriting, to none other than Patricia's brother. The sums were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then came the medical files. Dad had obtained copies of his own prescriptions and medical records, comparing them over time. He had written notes in the margins, expressing concerns about changes in his medication that always seemed to coincide with Patricia's trips to the pharmacy. One note read, "Blue pills, drowsy, confused afterward." The thumb drive was the final digital nail in the coffin. I plugged it into my laptop that night at the hotel, and what I heard left me cold. Recordings from Dad's home office. Audio he had clearly set up for his protection. In one file, Patricia's voice was unmistakable, casual and cold. "Make sure he takes the blue pills first," she told Mason. "They make him sleepy so he won't fuss about the rest." Mason's voice responded with a grunt of acknowledgement. In another recording, Lindsay joked about what she planned to do once the old man is gone. Patricia responded with a laugh, saying, "Well, you won't have to wait long. Everything's nearly in place." And then, as if to tie it all together, Dad had left a handwritten timeline, a personal journal charting the decline of his health against Patricia's increasing control. He noted dates when he felt especially unwell, linking them to meals Patricia had prepared or times she insisted on managing his pills. He noted isolation, disorientation, and unexplained symptoms. It was more than documentation. It was a cry for help from beyond the grave. By the time I closed the box, a horrifying realization had set in. My father hadn't merely been manipulated or stolen from, he had possibly been medically abused, even poisoned, by the woman he had trusted. And now, she was preparing to inherit everything. I gathered the materials and secured them in my bag, treating them like the sacred relics they were. Dad had given me everything I needed to fight back. The only question was when and where. That opportunity came faster than expected. The reading of the will was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I wasn't formally invited, of course, but Dad's former attorney, Walter Bennett, a man who had served our family faithfully for over 30 years before Patricia abruptly replaced him, reached out. We met at a quiet cafe the day before. "Something stinks about all this, Amber," Walter told me, stirring his coffee. "Robert would never have shut you out like this. And firing me, after decades, it doesn't add up." He passed me a folded slip of paper with the time and address. "Be there. I don't know what you'll walk into, but you deserve to be present." The next afternoon, I arrived at the offices of Harrison and Powell promptly at 2 o'clock. The receptionist's eyes widened when I gave my name. "Miss Mitchell, I'm sorry, you're not on the list," she said after checking the appointment schedule. "I'm Robert Mitchell's daughter," I replied calmly. "I have a right to hear the contents of his will." She looked uncertain but made a call. After a brief whispered conversation, she asked me to wait. Moments later, Gregory Harrison himself emerged from the conference room. His expression was equal parts surprise and discomfort. "Miss Mitchell, this is a bit unexpected. The reading has already begun. Mrs. Mitchell indicated that you were aware you were not included." "I'm still his daughter," I said, holding his gaze. "Whether I'm in the will or not, I deserve to hear it from your lips, not from Patricia's smug smile." He hesitated, then nodded. "Very well, please follow me." As I entered the room, heads turned. Patricia's face cycled through disbelief, fury, and finally an infuriating mask of superiority. Mason and Lindsay flanked her, along with Patricia's brother and her assistant. "What is she doing here?" Patricia hissed, refusing to look at me. "She has a right to be here," Harrison replied, his tone firm. "This meeting is for heirs named in the will," Patricia snapped. Amber is not one of them. Robert made his wishes very clear. Her confidence oozed from every word. I could feel the bile rising in my throat, but I swallowed it. I didn't come to argue, I came to reveal. I'm not here to make a scene, I said evenly. I simply want to hear what my father put in writing, whether or not it includes me. Harrison seemed relieved by my calm demeanor and resumed reading. The will dated January 15th of this year, he began, outlining that the entirety of Robert Mitchell's estate, everything from the $2,800,000 family home to his $12 million company shares and all associated assets, was to be transferred to Patricia Mitchell, with secondary beneficiaries being Mason and Lindsay Winters. Patricia gave me a smile that could cut glass. Robert always took care of his family, she said with a sigh. He knew who was there for him. Are there any questions? Harrison asked. I reached into my bag. Actually, yes, I said, rising to my feet. I placed a sealed envelope in front of him. This is my father's most recent will, dated 6 months ago and filed with the Commonwealth. It was executed under the supervision of Harrington and Associates, a different firm. This will supersede the one you're holding. All eyes turned to me. Patricia went rigid. This is ridiculous, she barked. Robert would have told me if he updated his will. Harrison broke the seal and began reading. His expression shifted from skepticism to grim concern. This appears to be legally binding, Harrison began cautiously, examining the new document in his hands. While it is dated more recently than the previous will we've just read, it bears Robert Mitchell's authentic signature, which I recognize from years of working with him. It also includes the proper witness attestations and an official notary seal. He looked up slowly, his eyes landing on Patricia, who had gone visibly pale. Her hands gripped the armrests of her chair and her mouth opened, but no sound came. Mrs. Mitchell, Harrison asked carefully, were you aware of this second document? This is absurd, she snapped, her voice sharp and high-pitched. It's a forgery, a complete fabrication. But Harrison continued flipping through the pages, his brows knitting as he read. This will contain clear language revoking all prior wills and codicils. If verified, it would indeed supersede the one we were previously reviewing. Read it, I said quietly but firmly. With a heavy breath, Harrison cleared his throat and began. But unfolded was a will that reflected my father's true intentions, balanced, deliberate, and far more just. Patricia and her children were not completely cut out. Instead, they were provided for in the form of modest, controlled trust funds, sufficient to sustain them comfortably, but with no access to the estate's principal assets. They were not permitted to sell, alter, or leverage the trusts in any way. The family home was to be sold, with the proceeds directed toward establishing a charitable foundation in my mother's name, an organization meant to support families dealing with cancer, as we once had. The bulk of the estate, including a controlling interest in Mitchell Development Corporation, was left to me. My father included a detailed letter of intent. I was to carry on his vision of ethical real estate development and philanthropic work. There were outlined plans for expansion, notes on community projects he hoped I would complete, and heartfelt language about how he trusted me to protect his life's work. And then came the most damning clause. In the event of my death under circumstances that may appear suspicious or untimely, Harrison read aloud, I direct my executor to authorize a full investigation, including comprehensive toxicology screening and a review of all medical treatment administered in the final 6 months of my life. A silence so thick you could feel it hung in the room. Patricia's expression twisted, no longer controlled or composed, but contorted with sheer rage. This is a lie, she shouted, a complete and malicious fabrication. Robert would never do this. He loved me. Tell them, she turned to her children, tell them, your father would never betray us like this. Mason's face was blank, eyes wide with shock. Lindsay had begun crying again, but even her sobs lacked conviction. They were unprepared for this revelation. Harrison raised a hand, calm and authoritative. Mrs. Mitchell, please. This document appears to meet every requirement for legal validity. If you wish to contest it, you'll need to proceed through the appropriate legal channels. Contested? Patricia seethed. I'll destroy it. This is some trick. Robert would never have gone behind my back. That ungrateful... She stopped herself mid-sentence, but the damage was done. Her brother reached for her shoulder, trying to calm her, but she shoved him off with a furious jerk. Her veneer had cracked completely, revealing the chaos underneath. Mrs. Mitchell, Harrison said again, his tone firmer now, I must advise you that these kinds of emotional outbursts will not benefit your position should you choose to contest the will. Furthermore, the document includes sealed instructions and provisions regarding potential investigations. I recommend you tread very carefully from this point forward. At the mention of investigations, Patricia went rigid. Her eyes darted toward the door, calculating. For a brief moment, I thought she might bolt. "I think you know exactly what this means," I said, my voice calm and clear. "Dad saw through you in the end. This is his final statement, and you're not going to silence him." "You know nothing," she spat. "Your father was a confused old man. He had no idea what he was signing." At that, Harrison intervened. "Enough. I believe it's in everyone's best interest to adjourn this meeting until we can confirm the authenticity of this new document. That said, I must acknowledge that the firm that executed it is both reputable and well-known. Their filings will be a matter of public record." "There is nothing to confirm," Patricia snapped. "I'm his wife." She stood abruptly, gathering her belongings in a whirlwind of fury. "This meeting is over. My attorney will be in touch." As she stormed toward the door, she paused just long enough to glare at me. "This isn't over, Amber." Her children followed behind her, Mason casting one last glance at me, an unreadable expression on his face. The room fell into a heavy silence. Harrison looked at me, clearly shaken. "Miss Mitchell, I had no knowledge of this revised will. I apologized for the confusion." "I understand," I replied. "My father knew exactly what she was capable of. That's why he planned ahead." As I collected my own things, I felt an unfamiliar sense of calm settle over me. This was far from the end. Patricia wasn't going to surrender quietly, but I had taken the first step. Dad had reached beyond the grave to protect me and his legacy. The fallout began immediately. Patricia refused to vacate the family home. She changed the security codes and instructed the staff to deny me entry under any circumstances. She sent me a barrage of text messages, alternating between venomous threats and manipulative attempts to gaslight me about my father's state of mind. Her brother left ominous voicemails warning me to back off before things get unsettled. I checked out of my hotel and moved into another under an alias, wary of what Patricia might do next. The following day, I met with Caroline Lawson, an attorney who specialized in contested wills and probate fraud. She was sharp, methodical, and unafraid of confrontation. "Your father was very thorough," Caroline said after reviewing the new will and supporting materials. "By using an independent firm and filing everything directly with the state, he created a strong foundation. Patricia contested, but she'll have to prove he wasn't of sound mind at the time." "He was lucid," I said, "and scared. He knew something wasn't right. These medical records, they suggest Patricia was tampering with his prescriptions." Caroline's eyes narrowed. "If that's true, then we're not just talking about a contested will. We're talking about criminal liability. But proving it, that will be difficult." Together, we mapped out a legal strategy. Caroline filed emergency motions to freeze all estate assets and to have Patricia removed as executor, citing the explicit clauses in the new will and the evidence from the safety deposit box. In retaliation, Patricia launched a full-scale smear campaign. She told my father's friends and business associates that I had manipulated a grieving, confused man driven by jealousy and resentment to rewrite his legacy. She painted herself as the true victim, the widow of a once great man destroyed by a scheming daughter. But I was ready for the next battle. "She poisoned him against his new family," I overheard Patricia say to one of my father's golf club members. The bitterness in her voice was sharp as glass. She couldn't stand that Robert found happiness again after her mother died. The cruel irony of her using the word poisoned was not lost on me. It had been a week since the contentious will reading, and I was back in my hotel room, attempting to piece together the chaos that had consumed my life. As I reached my door, something felt off. The door was slightly ajar, not fully closed, the lock half engaged. A wave of dread rippled through me. I didn't go inside. Instead, I called hotel security and waited in the hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs. When the security team arrived and we entered together, my worst suspicions were confirmed. The room had clearly been searched. My belongings had been moved, drawers opened, and suitcases shifted. It wasn't an obvious ransacking, but to someone who had lived out of that space for days, the changes were unmistakable. The most troubling discovery? The copies of my father's medical records were gone. Luckily, I had anticipated something like this and had stored the originals in a secure off-site location, but the breach left me shaken. The hotel's security footage showed a man in a maintenance uniform entering the room late that afternoon. Unfortunately, the footage was grainy and his face never came fully into frame. The hotel manager was apologetic but limited in what he could do. He offered a room change and additional security measures, which I accepted. Still, the sense of violation lingered. That evening, my phone buzzed with an unexpected message. "Mason need to talk. Not with Mom. Plaza Cafe tomorrow 10 a.m. I hesitated. It could be a trap, but something about the message felt genuine, and my curiosity overpowered my caution. I agreed, but not before scouting the cafe ahead of time, ensuring it was a public and neutral location with multiple exits. Mason arrived alone, eyes shadowed with fatigue and confusion. He looked like someone bearing the weight of too many secrets. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he admitted, his voice low as he stirred his coffee absently. "Mom's unraveling. She drinks all day now. She's been on the phone constantly, calling people, yelling. And the other night, I saw her burning papers in the backyard." My stomach turned. "Burning what kind of papers?" "I don't know. Financial stuff, I think. She caught Lindsay and me watching from the porch and lost it, sent us to our rooms." He paused, rubbing his face with both hands. "And I found something, in her bathroom, prescription bottles, with your dad's name, but the labels were ripped. I think she was hiding them." A chill swept through me. "Mason, do you understand what that could mean?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I'm not stupid, I just—" He trailed off, pain flashing in his eyes. "She's my mom." "But Robert—" "You need to tell the police," I urged him. "I can't," he said quickly, fear etched into his face. "But I'm not going to lie for her either. If this goes to court, I'll tell the truth." As he stood to leave, he hesitated. "Lindsay wants to talk to you too. She's scared, confused. Mom controls her, always has. But she really loved Robert." 2 days later, I met Lindsay at a modest cafe on the edge of town. She looked very different from the polished girl I once knew. Her makeup was smudged, her hair unkempt, her eyes rimmed red from crying. "Is it true?" she demanded as she sat down. "Did Mom really get left out of the real will?" "Yes, completely," I explained gently. "Dad created trusts for you and Mason. You'll be taken care of, just not in the way she expected." Lindsay stared down at the table, twisting a napkin between her fingers. "She promised me the beach house, said I could have it when Robert died. I didn't think—" She trailed off, visibly shaken. "When did she start making those promises?" I asked. "I don't know, maybe a year ago. She kept saying when Robert's gone, everything will be better. I thought she meant after retirement or something. I didn't think she meant—" Her voice broke off. I reached out to comfort her, but she recoiled, guilt and fear tangled in her expression. "I should go," she said quickly. "If she finds out I talked to you—" Despite everything, I felt a pang of sympathy for them. Patricia's children weren't monsters. They were her pawns, shaped by her manipulation, trapped in her web. The following week, everything escalated. Patricia stormed into a high-priced charity gala my father had championed for years. She wasn't invited, but made her presence known in spectacular fashion. I was speaking with board members when I heard her shrill voice cut through the room. "There she is," she shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. "The daughter who abandoned her father for years. Now she's stealing his legacy." Security rushed to remove her, but not before she hurled a series of public accusations that left the room buzzing. The next morning, our confrontation was splashed across the society pages under a sensational headline. The drama had gone public. That night, the threats began. An anonymous text, "Back off or regret it." Then an email, photos of me coming and going from my new hotel. Someone was following me, watching me. The message was clear, I wasn't safe. I contacted the police and my attorney, Caroline, immediately. She fast-tracked all our motions and arranged for additional security. We also discovered that Patricia had retained a notoriously aggressive probate attorney, someone known for dragging out estate disputes until the other party gave up or settled. "She's trying to bleed you dry," Caroline warned. "Her tactic is to make this process so miserable and expensive that you'll walk away just to end it." But Patricia had underestimated two things: my father's foresight and my determination. While reviewing more of my father's private files, I stumbled across something extraordinary. Tucked inside a locked drawer was an investigative report, one Dad had commissioned himself before he died. It revealed that Patricia had lied about more than just her relationship with her ex-husband. She had been married twice before, not once as she claimed. Her first husband had been a wealthy older man, much like my father, who died suddenly of heart failure after just 3 years of marriage. Patricia inherited everything, while the man's children were left with nothing. The pattern was horrifyingly familiar. Even more damning, Dad's private investigator had uncovered that Patricia and her supposed ex-husband, Mason and Lindsay's father, had never officially divorced. Their separation had been a charade. Surveillance footage showed them acting like a couple, not ex-spouses, long after they claimed to be apart. The implications were staggering. Patricia wasn't just a schemer, she was a serial predator. a woman who built her life by targeting, marrying, and manipulating vulnerable men for their wealth. I lay awake that night, haunted by the question that refused to let go. Had she simply waited for my father's health to fail, or had she helped it along? The police took direct action when Patricia violated a temporary restraining order I had obtained following the threats. Her reckless behavior was finally catching up to her, and she was running out of places to hide. Patricia's unraveling hit its peak one evening when she showed up uninvited at a downtown restaurant where I was having dinner with Eleanor. I had just taken a sip of wine when I heard the shrill, unmistakable voice cut through the gentle hum of conversation. "There you are, you lying little witch," Patricia screamed as she stormed toward our table. Gasps rippled across the restaurant. Diners turned to stare, forks halfway to mouths, conversations forgotten. "You think you can steal everything? You think Robert loved you more than us?" she shrieked, lunging toward me. I stood, shielding Eleanor instinctively. The staff moved quickly, restraining Patricia before she could reach me. One of the managers signaled for the police. When the officers arrived and reviewed the situation, their demeanor shifted significantly upon learning of the existing restraining order. As they cuffed her and prepared to escort her out, one officer leaned toward his partner and muttered, "She smells like a pharmacy." I caught the phrase and locked eyes with him, and he gave a slight knowing nod. More pieces were falling into place. But Patricia wasn't finished. She had one final desperate gambit left. 3 weeks after the will reading, the courtroom sat in a heavy hush. It was the day of the preliminary hearing on the contested will. I sat beside Caroline, nerves simmering beneath my calm exterior, while across the aisle, Patricia and her attorney, Martin Drake, exuded cold defiance. Mason sat stiffly behind his mother, visibly uncomfortable. Lindsay, however, was conspicuously absent. Judge Harriet Walcott presided, a stern, no-nonsense woman with short silver hair and an unimpressed expression. She scanned the room before beginning. "I want to be very clear before we proceed," she said, her gaze landing firmly on Patricia. "This court has zero tolerance for the kind of behavior outlined in the recent incident reports. Harassment, intimidation, and violations of protective orders will not serve your cause, Mrs. Mitchell." Patricia barely reacted, though her lawyer rose quickly to interject. "Your Honor," Drake began with oily smoothness, "my client categorically denies any harassment. We believe these are simply emotional family misunderstandings, exaggerated during a time of loss." Judge Walcott didn't blink. "Save it for your arguments, counselor. Let's get to the matter of the wills." Drake opened by asserting the January will, Patricia's favored version, as the valid one, and painted the July revision as either forged or the result of undue influence. His presentation was slick, but it lacked substance. Caroline rose next and, with practiced precision, dismantled his assertions piece by piece. She submitted affidavits from the witnesses who had been present for the signing of the July will, along with notarization logs and official state filing confirmations. Then came Walter Bennett, my father's former attorney, called to testify. "Robert reached out to me about 7 months ago," Walter said, his voice strong. "He was concerned about his wife's behavior and wanted an unbiased attorney to help him revise his estate plan without her knowledge." He turned to look Patricia directly in the eye. He was lucid, concerned about financial irregularities and, more troubling, about the changes in his medication. He believed Patricia was intentionally cutting him off from Amber and other friends. Drake objected here. He just allowed the testimony as indicative of my father's state of mind. The most unexpected moment came when Mason asked to speak. Patricia's head whipped around, hissing under her breath, "Don't you dare!" But Mason ignored her. He walked slowly to the witness stand, each step heavy with guilt and uncertainty. "I don't want to be here," he admitted, "but I found prescription bottles in Mom's room with Robert's name. I saw her burn papers. I overheard her on the phone with James, her ex, talking about how it was time to move things along. She made it hard for Amber to see him in the hospital. Too hard." He glanced toward me, eyes wet. "Robert was good to us. He didn't deserve what happened, and Amber doesn't deserve this now." Patricia's expression morphed into something venomous. Her eyes burned with fury as Mason stepped down. When Drake called her to the stand, Patricia had recomposed herself. She played the role of bereaved widow convincingly, voice trembling as she spoke of my supposed abandonment, of Robert's decline, and how our happy blended family had been ripped apart by my supposed greed and jealousy. But Caroline was ready. She took Patricia through a detailed timeline, dates, locations, receipts, and cornered her with contradictions. "Mrs. Mitchell," she began evenly, "you stated you never left your husband's side during his final days. Yet your credit card shows a dinner for two at Chez Maurice the night before his death. Care to explain?" It was just a meeting, Patricia faltered. A business dinner. With James Winters, the same man you told Robert you never wanted to see again? Caroline asked, her tone razor sharp. The man you claimed abandoned you? Drake objected, but Judge Walcott leaned forward. It's relevant, Mr. Drake. Caroline pressed on, exposing lie after lie, until Patricia's well-rehearsed persona began to crack. Her voice rose, she fumbled dates, she contradicted herself repeatedly. After closing arguments, Judge Walcott called a brief recess. When she returned, her ruling was swift and clear. Based on the documentation, testimony, and evidentiary support, she declared, I find the July 15th will to be valid and legally enforceable. The January will is hereby revoked. She turned toward Patricia. Mrs. Mitchell, you are removed as executor of the estate. Miss Amber Mitchell is appointed executor as designated. Patricia gasped audibly. I felt the air return to my lungs. The judge wasn't done. Additionally, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for further investigation into potential elder abuse, fraud, and medical misconduct, Mrs. Mitchell is ordered to vacate the family property within 48 hours and turn over all financial documentation relating to Mr. Mitchell's estate. As we exited the courtroom, a man stepped forward. Detective Liam Connolly, badge flashing from his jacket, nodded at me. Miss Mitchell, I'd like to speak to you about your father's medical records, he said. The following weeks were a whirlwind of revelations. The police investigation uncovered that Patricia had never legally divorced James Winters, making her marriage to my father possibly invalid. More shocking still, toxicology results from preserved hospital blood samples revealed dangerously elevated levels of dioxin, a potent heart medication my father had never been prescribed. Patricia's lies unraveled faster than anyone anticipated. The final blow came from Lindsay. Perhaps moved by guilt or a desire to protect herself, she turned over a journal she had found. In Patricia's own handwriting, it detailed my father's medications combinations, reactions, dosages, and notes on which drugs made him more compliant and forgetful. That journal was the final nail. With that journal in hand, Caroline and Detective Connolly worked in tandem, reviewing every entry. The notes were chilling. Patricia had meticulously recorded dosages, reactions, and even mood changes. Some entries read like scientific experiments, others like a manual for manipulation. Lower dose of atenolol, he's more alert, must increase blue pill mix before breakfast to offset. Blue pills before bed equals sleeps deeper, no calls to Amber. Each entry deepened the horror. When confronted, Patricia denied everything at first. But as the evidence piled up, bank records, emails, the journal, and witness testimonies, her confidence faltered. Mason and Lindsay were granted immunity in exchange for full cooperation, both of them testifying to her erratic behavior and long-standing deception. Charges followed swiftly: fraud, elder abuse, obstruction, and attempted manslaughter. The media caught wind of the story, and headlines splashed across Boston newspapers. Socialite widow charged in scheme to defraud poison real estate tycoon. Daughter battles stepmother in explosive estate scandal. For weeks I was in the eye of a media storm. But through it all, I held tight to one thing, my father's voice, steady in my mind. You have your mother's instincts, Amber. Trust them. His words had saved me, and ultimately, they had helped bring the truth into the light. Criminal charges were swiftly brought against Patricia, ranging from fraud and elder abuse to being an accessory to involuntary manslaughter. The indictment also named James Winters, her longtime partner in deception and technically still her legal husband, as a co-conspirator. While the legal process was expected to drag on for months, perhaps even years, one thing was certain: Patricia's stranglehold over my father's life and legacy had finally been broken. Media outlets devoured the scandal, turning our personal tragedy into front-page fodder. Headlines like Black Widow Strikes Again and Daughter's Private Investigation Exposes Chilling Plot sensationalized the pain we had endured. I turned down every interview request, refusing to become part of their entertainment cycle. Instead, I focused on what mattered: honoring my father's memory, restoring the home we had once shared, and rebuilding the pieces of my life that Patricia had tried to dismantle. As I walked through the halls of the family estate, now emptied of Patricia's sterile modern decor, I discovered artifacts that felt like pieces of my soul being returned. Hidden away in attic trunks and basement boxes were framed photographs of my mother that had mysteriously vanished, old letters exchanged between my parents during their early courtship, and even my childhood drawings that Dad had once proudly displayed in his study. One afternoon, as I reorganized his library, I found a hidden panel behind a bookshelf. Inside was a weathered lockbox containing a stack of DVDs and a small camcorder. The discs were labeled with dates, many from my early childhood, others much more recent. One bore the date from just 2 months before his death. My heart pounded as I slid it into the player and sat on the floor to watch. The screen flickered, and there was Dad, thinner than I remembered, pale, but his eyes were sharp and filled with love. "Remember," he said, staring directly into the camera. "If you're watching this, then things have likely gone the way I feared. First, let me say that I love you. I'm sorry. I should have trusted your instincts sooner." He paused, wiping a tear from his cheek. "You were right about Patricia. I didn't want to believe it. I was lonely, and she filled a void, but I see now that I was blind. I've tried to correct my mistakes. The will, the foundation, the safe-to-deposit box, I did all of it to protect you and what your mother and I built." I sobbed quietly, whispering, "I forgive you, Dad," to the screen. "Remember what matters," he continued. "It's not the money, the house, or the company. It's integrity, kindness, and perseverance. Those are the things that built our family. Those are your real inheritance, and no one can take them from you." Watching that final message, I felt his presence stronger than I had in months. His words wrapped around me like a warm blanket. He hadn't just left me a financial legacy, he had left me purpose, vision, and love. 6 months after the legal showdown, I finally moved back into the family home. At first, I considered selling it, per the original intent of the estate plan. But as I stood in the sun-drenched foyer, I realized the house was more than just property. It was memory. It was a symbol of survival and renewal. With guidance from my legal team, I modified the terms of the will to retain ownership and instead converted part of the estate into the headquarters for the Elizabeth Mitchell Foundation, named after my mother. The foundation would be dedicated to cancer research and to supporting children who had lost parents to illness. It felt right. It felt like healing. Through the foundation, both of my parents' legacies could live on, not just as names on a plaque, but in the tangible aid given to families like ours. I restored the house with care, stripping away the cold, impersonal aesthetic Patricia had imposed and replacing it with the warm, inviting charm my mother had originally infused into every room. Soft rugs, family heirlooms, hand-stitched quilts, and the scent of old books returned. The antique grandfather clock that had stood silent since Patricia's arrival ticked again in the hallway, a symbol of time reclaimed. Eleanor, who had remained at Mitchell Development through the transition, joined me one afternoon for tea in the sunroom, a room that had once been my mother's sanctuary. "Your father would be so proud," she said, her eyes misting as she looked around. "He worried constantly at the end, not about money, but about whether his legacy would survive intact." "Did he ever tell you what first raised his suspicions?" I asked. Eleanor nodded. "It was something small, actually. He caught Patricia removing a photo of your mother from his nightstand while she thought he was asleep. She claimed she was dusting, but it planted the seed. From there, he started noticing the subtle shifts, how isolated he'd become, how dependent he felt. We talked for hours, piecing together a fuller picture of my father's final year, his fears, his hopes, and his unwavering love for me. Eleanor shared that he had secretly stayed in contact with many of his old friends, even inviting them to meet in private when Patricia wasn't home. "He never stopped talking about you," she said. "Every little update, every phone call, that was his joy." Meanwhile, the criminal proceedings against Patricia moved forward. She remained behind bars, denied bail due to both the severity of her crimes and her clear flight risk. Mason had agreed to testify in exchange for immunity, while Lindsay's case was handled more delicately. Psychiatric evaluations concluded that Lindsay had been deeply manipulated, suffering from a psychological condition known as enmeshed dependence. Her world had been shaped by Patricia's lies. She was placed in therapy and went to live with her biological aunt, her father's sister, who had expressed a desire to help her heal. Though part of me wanted to distance myself entirely from Mason and Lindsay, I couldn't ignore the truth. They, too, had been victims. With the guidance of the Foundation's board, I created modest but meaningful educational trusts for them, conditional on academic achievement and public service. It was my way of breaking the cycle, offering them a path forward without strings, shame, or judgment. Mason enrolled in community college and began studying psychology, perhaps to understand the tangled web he'd grown up in. Lindsay, though still fragile, expressed a desire to become a counselor for children of dysfunctional families. The home slowly came alive again. I reopened rooms that had been shuttered, restored the garden to its former glory, and brought back the sailboat models my father and I had built together over the years. In the study, I hung his portrait alongside my mother's, a visual reunion that made the house feel whole again. 3 months after I moved back in, I organized a new memorial service, one worthy of the man my father truly was. Held at his beloved sailing club, the event was intimate, filled with laughter, music, and the warm embrace of old friends. They told stories I'd never heard, of daring business ventures, spontaneous road trips, quiet acts of charity, and each tale painted a fuller portrait of the man I already adored. We lit candles and released paper lanterns into the harbor, each one a tribute to his enduring spirit. As I watched the lanterns drift across the water, a sense of peace settled over me. My father's life had been hijacked, twisted by someone who never truly knew him, but in the end the truth had prevailed. His legacy of integrity, love, and perseverance had survived. And I was home. Robert always believed that a person's true wealth wasn't found in bank accounts or real estate portfolios, but in the impact they left on the people around them. "A man is as rich as the love and respect he earns," Walter said during our final toast to Dad at the sailing club's quiet memorial, his voice thick with emotion. And by that measure, Robert Mitchell was the wealthiest man I've ever known. As I listened to each person share their memories, stories of kindness, generosity, quiet strength, and subtle humor, I realized how much of my father's life I had never fully seen. These friends, colleagues, and old acquaintances each held a different piece of the man who had raised me. They painted a portrait more expansive than I could have imagined. The entrepreneur who mentored young developers, the friend who remembered birthdays with handwritten cards, the neighbor who shoveled snowy driveways before others awoke. The process of healing after his death was neither smooth nor predictable. Grief came in waves, some gentle, others fierce and overwhelming. There were days I couldn't get out of bed, when memories became daggers and silence echoed too loudly in the halls of the family home. Other times, anger surged burning sharp, the deliberate manipulation, the poisoned trust, the cruel, calculated way she hastened his decline. But through the anguish, unexpected blessings surfaced. I discovered reservoirs of strength I hadn't known I possessed. I found allies in unlikely places, Eleanor, Walter, even Mason and Lindsay, in their own complicated ways. And I learned to trust my instincts, the same ones my father had always urged me to follow. "Your mother had the best intuition I ever knew," he once told me, "and you inherited it." Most importantly, I had protected my father's final wishes. His legacy, his company, his values, his memory had not been lost to the schemes of a con artist. I had honored him in the most meaningful way possible. As time passed, I began establishing new routines. The Sunday mornings we used to spend sailing became my time for service. I volunteered at a local children's grief support center, offering a listening ear and a gentle presence. The holidays, which I had dreaded facing alone, slowly transformed into opportunities for healing. I began hosting gatherings for others who had experienced similar losses, finding connection and meaning in shared pain. One quiet spring morning, while reviewing foundation proposals in my father's study, I noticed a framed quote he had kept on his desk. "The greatest inheritance a parent can give their children is a few minutes of their time each day." Simple, profound, and true. Despite all his professional success, my father's most treasured gift to me had always been his time, his presence, his attention, his unwavering belief in me. That was the legacy I carried forward, not just his wealth but his values. The foundation thrived under that philosophy, supporting causes rooted in compassion, education, and justice. Every child we helped, every family we supported, felt like a quiet continuation of his story. Eventually, justice caught up with Patricia. She was convicted on multiple counts, including fraud, elder abuse, and being an accessory to involuntary manslaughter. The sentence, 20 years in prison. When I heard the verdict, I didn't feel the triumph I once thought I might. No righteous satisfaction, just a deep exhale. Justice had been served. Dad could finally rest in peace. True to my word, I kept occasional contact with Mason and Lindsay. Our meetings were cautious, held on neutral ground, always tinged with the scars of what had happened. But they were trying to understand, to grow, to disentangle themselves from the toxic legacy of their mother. Mason found direction through community college and part-time work. Lindsay, still fragile but slowly emerging from her mother's shadow, continued therapy and expressed dreams of becoming a counselor herself. Forgiveness was not a destination but a journey, and I chose to walk it one step at a time. Looking back on the turbulent path I had traveled, from that awful night when Mason called to say my father was in the hospital, to the chaotic courtrooms and private revelations, I saw not just tragedy, but transformation. Grief had tempered me. Pain had refined me. I was no longer the daughter who needed her father to validate her instincts. I had become a woman who trusted herself, who stood up for truth, and who honored love not just in memory, but in action. In the end, my father's final gift wasn't the financial estate that Patricia had fought so ruthlessly to obtain. It was the truth, the painful, freeing truth, and the opportunity to reclaim not just his wealth, but the legacy of integrity and compassion he had cultivated throughout his life. On the first anniversary of his death, I visited his grave alone. The The cemetery was quiet, bathed in early morning light. I placed a bouquet of white roses, his favorite, by the headstone, and traced the engraved words with my fingers. "I kept my promise, Dad," I whispered. "Your story was told, your wishes were honored, your legacy lives on." That day, I didn't leave feeling heavy with grief. I left filled with peace. I had learned something vital through this journey, something my father had understood in his final days. That family isn't always defined by blood or name, or even shared history. True family is forged in mutual respect, shared values, and unwavering support. My father had chosen to redefine family not through obligation, but through authenticity. That principle became my compass moving forward. Now, I am careful with the people I allow into my life. I look for substance over sparkle, character over charm. The financial security my father left behind is a blessing, but it is the lessons learned through adversity that guide me most. I use that wealth to build something better, to help others, to heal others, to stay true to the integrity he so deeply valued. If you, reading this, have experienced betrayal from within your own family, if you found yourself forced to fight for what's rightfully yours, know this: you are not alone. Trust your gut, gather your evidence, speak your truth, and never underestimate the power of justice, even when it comes slowly. Family conflicts over inheritance don't just reveal greed, they reveal character. And in those moments, you learn who truly belongs in your story. Thank you for walking with me through this painful but transformative journey. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share. Your voice matters, and your truth, just like mine, deserves to be heard. Remember, our greatest strength often rises from the ashes of our greatest pain.